Good evening. I'm Lieutenant Mike McGee. I'm the pastor at the Salvation Army in Alamance County. That's right, we are a church, and this is our video Bible study. We've been studying how we got our Bible. In a couple of weeks, we're going to start talking about some of those more controversial topics like canonization, how we decided what books should be in the Bible and what books were not included, and translation and transmission and all those kind of things. We're going to be talking about that in a few weeks. But these first few weeks, we've just been trying to set up some basics, some ground rules in terms of what assumptions we make, what things we bring to the Bible when we show up. And so week one, we talked about inspiration. We talked about the idea that the Bible is God-breathed. That's what it says when Paul writes to Timothy. But we know that they say, hey, there are these books out there that are God-breathed. They are inspired by God. The second week, we talked about the divine human book, and we talked about why God would choose to use people as a way to transmit his holy word. Today, we want to start talking about, we're not going to finish this today, but we want to start talking about kind of the individual books of the Bible and looking at who wrote them, who did they write them to, and why did they write them to those people. To understand when we read a verse, who wrote it, why were they writing it, who were they writing it to, what was their intent for their original audience, and then what does that mean for us? We want to start just from the basis of, well, where did the books come from? Before we can talk about what books were included or not included, we have to talk about where the books came from. And so we want to start by talking about that today. And so we're going to go over a whole lot today. We're going to go over it very quickly. And so I want to encourage you, if you have questions, make sure you give them, if you're able to catch this during the live premiere, put them in the chat and we'll try and answer them today. If you're not able to catch us live, drop them in the comments and we'll work on getting around to those at some point. And so we're going to dive right in. We're going to cover a lot today. Maybe you want to rewatch the video later on. Maybe you want to try and take notes. Maybe you just want to listen along and retain what you retain and not worry about the rest. But I do want to give you a heads up. We're going to cover a lot today as we're going to aim to just fly through some books of history today. And we're going to try and get through all the books of history in the Old Testament. When we divide up the Old Testament, we divide it into different parts. And so the first part we're going to look at is a part called the Law. And the Law, it goes by a couple of different names. Some people call it the Pentateuch. That's its Greek name. And Pentateuch, it means these 5 books. The Law is 5 books. It's the first 5 books of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It also goes by another name. Torah is kind of the Hebrew word for it. And Torah literally means law. This is God's law. And sometimes it's called the Law of Moses. And we'll see it described that way. These books, tradition holds, these are written by Moses. That is, Moses is raised up, and maybe you know some of Moses' story, but he was a Jewish boy. He was set down the river. Pharaoh's daughter found him and raised him up, and so he was raised as an Egyptian prince. He eventually killed a guy, went to hide in the desert for 40 years. Then God sent him back home to free his people. He led his people out of captivity and into the desert, and there in the desert, Moses really became and lived in the fullness of being God's mouthpiece to the people of Israel. That when we talk about some of that stuff we talked about last week, that God spoke through men to the people. Well, Moses it's really a big place. I won't say the first place, but it's a big place that we see that occur. And it's really, I would say, the first written place that we see that occur, that God speaks through Moses, and so Moses speaks to the people, and he writes down the things that he says. The words that make up the Torah, that make up the Pentateuch or the Law, those words are attributed to Moses. He's the one that writes those things down for us. So we know Moses wrote for the benefit of the people of Israel, who he's leading through the wilderness. And so as Moses is leading through the wilderness, that's why he writes. And he writes 5 books, and we'll talk about them really quickly, just quick highlights on these 5 books. So Genesis tells the story of how the world was made, of how man was made, about how kind of our earliest ancestors crept out into the world and how different languages were formed and all those kinds of things. We have here an account of how the world was made. The second book is Exodus. Exodus tells the story of the Exodus. It tells the story of the leaving, of how the people of Israel got up and got out of Egypt. And so we see about the plagues and we see all those kind of things. God sets the people of Israel free from their captivity in Egypt. Leviticus then gives us rules. So the people of Israel, they had no central government. They didn't have a constitution. They didn't have anything. So they needed rules and laws for how to live as they wandered through the wilderness together. And so Moses, from God, gives them rules. He gives them laws. He gives them instructions on how they're supposed to live, on how they're supposed to treat one another, about what proper worship of God looks like. Moses starts giving them teachings on that, and that is mostly recorded for us in the book of Leviticus. The book of Numbers is called Numbers because it lists people, as we get a count of who's here and who is included in the people of Israel. That's the book of Numbers. It says, hey, here's the people that are here. And so there's some other stuff in there, but for the most part, here's just a big list of people. And then finally, Deuteronomy lists or gives us Moses' final teaching for the people of Israel. So as Moses leads the people of Israel through the wilderness, and they get kind of to the edge of the promised land, but Moses knows he's not going to set foot on the promised land. And so we get the book of Deuteronomy, which maybe some of the earlier parts are some compilations of teachings, but especially as we get toward the end of Deuteronomy, we get kind of Moses' last sermon to the people of Israel. So those are the 5 books that make up really the heart of Jewish faith. If you're Jewish, I think to this day, you look at those 5 books as primary, and everything else is supporting those works or giving us more history or more instruction or a better understanding of things. But those 5 books make up the core of the Jewish faith. It's the story of God and his people, about how God made them, about how God called them out, and how he brought them to the place where they would be his people in his holy land. Then we move into the books of history. So Moses dies, and all of our faith writings up to the point Moses dies, they all came from Moses. Moses is replaced by a guy named Joshua. Back when the Israelites were first scoping out the promised land, Joshua was there. He was one of the spies along with Caleb, and Caleb and Joshua were the only 2 that came back and said, I think we can do it. God will be with us. And all the other spies said, no way, we can't take them. And so the people wandered 40 years because they didn't have the faith in God to go in and take the promised land at that time. And so that's who Joshua is, but Joshua ends up becoming kind of Moses' right-hand man. So when Moses dies, Joshua becomes the new leader of the people of Israel. And in terms of who wrote Joshua, tradition would hold that maybe Joshua wrote it, but Joshua goes into the promised land, into the land of Canaan, and begins to lead the conquest of Canaan. And really the idea is this is going to be God's holy land, and the people that are here are worshiping other gods. And so we have to, as the people of Israel, root out the worship of these other gods in this land that is supposed to be God's holy land. And so the first part of Joshua tells about how they go in and take over that land. The second part of Joshua talks about how they divide up the land. And a very important concept for the people of Israel was wholeness, that all of the tribes are represented here in the promised land, that everyone has, and as we go into the future, there's this idea that everyone has their ancestral land where they're supposed to be part of this community of God here in the promised land. And so Joshua, the first half, is an exciting story of conquering the land of Canaan. The second half is the story of how the land is divided up among the different tribes there. So the next set of books, as we roll through and look at Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, tradition's going to hold, hey, Samuel came along and he decided it was important that we recorded these things so that we would have a history of the people of Israel. So the first of those books, Judges, covers, the history of Israel. It covers from the time of Joshua all the way to the time of 1st Samuel. So if you're following along, we read Genesis takes us from the beginning of the world all the way to Moses' death. Joshua picks up with Moses' death, takes us all the way through to Joshua's death. Judges picks up after Joshua has died and carries us all the way through until 1st Samuel, when Samuel shows up on the scene as a little baby. That's kind of where Judges fits in chronologically. But during the time of the Judges, there was no central government for Israel. There was no leader. When they were in the wilderness, they had Moses. When they first kind of conquered Canaan, they had Joshua. Now it's the time of the Judges, and they have no central leader. Who are they supposed to look to for that leadership? They're supposed to look to God. But over and over again, they keep looking other places. And so the book of Judges shows us something called the cycle of apostasy. This is the story of how the people of Israel, over and over, they follow God, and then they start turning away and following other gods, and then bad stuff starts happening, and they keep getting oppressed, and so they cry out to God, and so God sends a redeemer, God sends a savior, God sends someone to come rescue the people of Israel, and we call those people judges. And so the judge shows up, rescues Israel, and then the Israelites worship God again for a time before they start to turn away again. And the cycle repeats itself over and over and over. There's an incredible opportunity in the book of Judges to see an image of kind of how we treat God sometimes. We just go through this cycle, and when I'm in trouble, I cry out for help, and then I have faith in God again, and then I turn away again. Ruth is also attributed to Samuel. While all the stuff is going on in Judges, that's when Ruth is written, or that's when Ruth is set as a story. And we think Samuel recorded this because it shows us something about David's lineage. We're showing the lineage of David, and we include Ruth. And there's something significant for us in the fact that this woman, Ruth, this outsider, I think she was a Moabite, she's an outsider, but she is part of David's lineage. And so we see how there's just this little image here of how someone's heart is more important than where they were born or what nation they belong to. 1 Samuel tells the story of Samuel's birth and his calling, and then it tells the story of how the people of Israel say, well, we want a king just like all these people around us have. And everyone else gets to have a king, we'd like to have one too. And so Samuel goes and finds a king for the people. God allows them to have a king, and that first king is Saul. And Saul starts off as a good king, but slowly turns crazy as he becomes jealous of David. 2 Samuel, for Samuel, David's reign was the most significant event in Israel's history. And that's evidenced by the fact that all of 2 Samuel is just talking about David's reign as king of Israel. We move into the Kings. Tradition holds that this was written by Jeremiah. We don't really know who wrote this, but we know that someone sat down and said, well, we need to record the story of all these other kings. We've got this history that when we start with Genesis and we work our way down through Joshua, down through the Judges, down through 1st and 2nd Samuel, we have a history of Israel all the way to David's death. We need a book to start with Solomon's reign, the son of David. And so Kings tells us the kind of tragic story about how Solomon begins to turn away from God, how this kingdom, the people of Israel split into two, and we now have a northern kingdom called Israel and a southern kingdom called Judah. And it tells the story about how the northern kingdom behaved wickedly and were eventually carried off by the Assyrians. And then it tells the story of how the southern kingdom, having watched this happen, does the same thing. And they're carried off into exile by the Babylonians. It kind of tells us this story of the people of Israel and the way they slowly turn away from God. And as they turn away from God, things just get worse and worse and worse until eventually they lose everything. Chronicles, the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we think maybe this was written by Ezra. The story of Chronicles tells basically the same story we see in Kings, but it gives a broader look. And so it will start all the way back with Adam. And Chronicles is going to trace the lineage all the way down from Adam to David. And then it's going to tell all these stories about all the kings. And it's going to come all the way into the time of captivity. And the book of Chronicles, 2nd Chronicles, ends with Cyrus' decree that the people of Israel can go home. And so that's where the book of Chronicles ends. So it tells mostly the same stories we see in Kings, but it brings kind of a broader historical look, and it's given us a look at this kingdom of Judah. And so that's what we get in Chronicles. In Ezra, we get the story of the return from captivity. Ezra, we pick up where 2nd Chronicles leaves off with this decree that the people of Israel can go back to Jerusalem after 70 years in captivity. And so Ezra is the guy charged with leading that return, and Ezra shows us about how the temple was rebuilt and how worship was restored. Nehemiah carries on the story of the return as we have different waves of returning, and Nehemiah comes back to rebuild the wall. So they've rebuilt this temple so that they can restore worship, and now they need to rebuild the wall so that they can kind of reestablish their place in this land. And so Nehemiah leads that effort. And then the last book we'll talk about as part of the historical books, these are all books, most everything we've talked about today could be lopped into the historical books section, but in particular everything from Joshua to Esther we call the historical books in the Old Testament, and they're books that tell us about the people of Israel, about what happened to them, where they went, when they followed God, when they didn't follow God, and what the consequences of those decisions were. And Esther is kind of the final book in that piece, and we believe it's probably written by Mordecai, who was there. And a couple of interesting things to me. We only have a couple of stories in the Old Testament where we say, particularly in the books of history, these stories where we say, hey, here's a whole book dedicated to the story of this individual. And those would be Ruth and Esther, two women. So we see that women are elevated in the Old Testament. They're esteemed in some ways. But Esther tells this story of how Haman wants to kill all of the Israelites in captivity. And so Esther comes along and sets things right. And so we see God's action on behalf of his people, even during their captivity. Even during their punishment, we see that God's grace is still shown to the people of Israel. And then the other thing that this does is it shows the need for the Feast of Purim. And this is a feast that Jewish people celebrate. And so the book of Esther exists and is included in the historical books because it's there to say, hey, when you celebrate this feast every year, this is what we're celebrating, when God rescued the people of Israel from Haman's plot to kill them all. So that's about as far as we're going to carry it for today, because I know that is a lot of information. Next week, we're going to pick up with the rest of the Old Testament. We're going to talk about those books of poetry and wisdom literature, and we'll talk through those things next week. And then we'll move on from there as we continue to try and understand how we got our Bible.